following is a recording of the 5th session of the BBS UK Saturday Conference 2016. Special Educational Needs, Applying for Education, Health and Care Plans by Eleanor Wright, SEO, SOS, SEN.
Hi everyone, thanks for inviting me. As just been said, this is going to be a really breathless rush through the education, the system for getting access to support for SEN. It's something which we provide workshops on, which spread over 3 or 4 days, so it's going to be very breathless. But we do have workshops this afternoon when we can put flesh on the bones and answer questions and so on. Just a little bit about our charity. We're here to help the families of children with special needs and disabilities, particularly with a focus on accessing the right support for their special educational needs. And we're working on the basis really of trying to enable parents and families and indeed older, what the system officially calls young people, to access that support and to know their rights. So the motto is almost knowledge is power. I'm afraid there is an awful, particularly since the law changed, there's an awful lot of misinformation, lack of knowledge in schools and local authorities about how the system is meant to work. And we find that parents and carers who really know their rights, know the system, are so much more empowered to basically stand up for themselves, not be misled about what their children's rights are. And we operate in various ways. The sort of mainstay is the helpline, which runs on weekdays and at the moment Wednesday evenings in term times, and that's run by volunteers. They're mostly parents of children with special needs who we've helped, some ex-teachers, some other willing souls, and they are brilliant. And what's particularly useful about the parental volunteers is, of course, that they've been through the system, they have children with difficulties, they know what it's like. We also run a number of drop-in centres, usually about once a month. There's one near Waterloo twice a month. I'm afraid they're mostly in the south. We have one outpost in Manchester. We're trying to spread that, but it depends on having local volunteers mostly. We will offer sort of longer one-to-one advice sessions at our office, which is just opposite Hampton Court station, very easy to find. And we'll help with other things like going to meetings, drafting letters, helping to an extent with appeals to the tribunal. We don't normally run them for people, but we'll help people with drafting the documents, very occasionally with representing. I've left some leaflets outside with more information about us, including contact details and information about things like the advice centres. One of the main things we do actually is workshops, usually about up to 10 people attending, can be half a day, all day, focusing very much on particular areas of the special needs system. And we've got information about those outside. You can get more information off our website and Facebook page. So diving in, what we're dealing with in legal terms under the new system is the Children and Families Act 2014, and the main set of regulations under them, which were also in 2014. And in practical terms, the most useful document is the Code of Practice. You have to look for the 2015 version, because there is an earlier one floating around if you're looking for it online. Used to be able to get this for free from the Department for Education, no longer. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you print it off because it's a lot of trees. One of the ironies of the new law is that it was meant to streamline the system, and the Code of Practice is twice as long as the old one. But what you mostly need for a child in school is roughly chapters 6 to 9. Chapter 5 is more, I think, about early years. Chapter 10 is about some specific circumstances like children with mental health difficulties, children in custody, that type of thing. If you look at nothing else, if you're in the system and if you're at the stage of getting an EHC plan, strongly recommend looking at Chapter 9, which is all about that process and what you can expect to find in it. The first half is a fair amount of fairly aspirational stuff about how wonderful the system is going to be, and about the local offer, which is one of the new things that the system brought in. Every local authority has to have on their website a local offer, which details all the provision available to children and young people in their areas with disabilities and SEN, including things like play schemes, social services support, health support, and in fact schools and things from outside that area, which are accessed by people within that area. And I would recommend you to have a look at it. I would say, however, that all of this is still really being developed because it's new. There are loads of amendment regulations. There are specific regulations about things like personal budgets and the process of transferring from the old system to the new one. And they're still just producing amendment ones when they find things that aren't working and are going wrong. I think we're in about the third or fourth set of amendment regulations. One day they'll consolidate it all and hope it'll be easier. So I'm not going to look at the law very much, but I'm looking here at one of the main sections, Section 19 of the Children and Families Act, which is the beginning of the section that deals with SEN, and the important sort of underlying principles. And the first three are really all about the fact that this is meant to be a process whereby local authorities and schools listen to children, parents, carers, young people, and pay attention to their views and wishes and feelings, and they participate in decisions. It is quite important because certainly under the old system, and to an extent still under the new one, people are still saying to us, they're not listening to me, they dashed ahead, they've ignored everything I've said. This is something you can refer to say, oi, you're supposed to be listening to me, you are not supposed to be ignoring me. The last one is sort of my favourite section, this one here. The local authorities have to have regard to the need to support the child or the young person to facilitate their development, help them achieve the best possible education and other outcomes. That last bit I have emphasised because it's a bit of a sea change from the previous law, where if you went through the previous system, you possibly got sick of hearing local authorities saying, we don't have to give Rolls-Royce provision, we only have to give adequate provision. I mean, to an extent, that's still correct, notably because of financial restrictions. But there is now in the legislation a big focus on outcomes, looking to achieve the best possible outcome. It's still not something you can get overexcited about because it's only a duty to have regard to it. It's not a duty to achieve it. But having said that, in legal terms, if you've got a duty to have regard to something, it means you should be doing it unless you've got a very good reason not to. And I think it is quite important because certainly under the old law, there was a culture, as I say, of very much good enough. You might, for instance, have an extremely able child academically, but they'd be saying, well, so long as they're bumping along the bottom somewhere, it doesn't really matter, whilst that child is getting incredibly frustrated. Or you could have a child who was severely disabled and they were more or less being left to stare at the walls. And no, you should not be doing that. You should be looking ahead to every stage in the child's future, as it were, and think about where you want them to be at 5, at 11, at 16, at 18, at 25 as an adult. And the older they get, the more you want to be looking towards adulthood and preparing for independence and self-care and getting into work, or simply leading, frankly, a fulfilling and happy life. Just a matter of terminology, there's a constant reference to children and young people. A young person is someone over the statutory school leaving age, which is past June the 30th in the academic year that they're 16. I know people have to stay in education for longer now, but that is statutory school leaving age, and it's an important distinction because once you become a young person, all the rights pass to you. It is the young person who can ask for an EHC plan, who's consulted about annual reviews, consulted about what school or college they want to go to. It's a young person who's got a right of appeal. But that doesn't mean that parents are out of the picture. There is an expectation that they still will be heavily involved. And of course, if the young person doesn't want to do it or doesn't feel able to do it, they can delegate. Just moving into what the SEN system is. When I started in the Dark Ages, there were 5 stages, then it went to 3, now we're at 2. What used to be School Action and School Action Plus, which were the stages in support before a statement, they're abolished, and instead we have a concept called SEN support, and the stage beyond that, what used to be a statement, is an education, health and care plan. And it's called that simply precisely because that is meant to be a holistic document which recognises that you don't really just separate out education issues. A lot of children with disabilities also have health and social care problems. Have pointed there that some authorities are coming with spiffing ideas. Hounslow has just come up with this one about an education support plan, which is for children who would probably qualify for a full EHC plan, but they say they don't have health and social care needs. Therefore, they're suggesting to schools, what you do is have this education support plan, which is a bit like an EHC plan, but a bit less. I've said not recommended because what's the point? If you qualify for an EHC plan, you're better off with that for reasons which I'll come to. You don't have to have health and care problems to qualify for an EHC plan. I don't understand the point of it. But just to be aware that you might have to deal with that. Just moving on to what happens in school, this is really looking at children who don't qualify for an EHC plan, particularly it's going to be some children in the primary stage, but it may not be, who can be supported within the system without an EHC plan. I'm afraid that in this area of the law, it gets a bit waffly because there aren't particularly hard specific duties that you can put your finger on or that you can enforce. But nevertheless, this is the framework that schools and nurseries and colleges and so on are supposed to be operating within. So their duty is to use their best endeavours to meet the needs of children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities indeed, whether they've got an EHC plan or not. And that means things like always being alert to identifying problems, meeting them, reviewing, and so on. There are the basic equality duties not to discriminate against someone by reason of disability. I'm talking here mostly about maintained schools, also academies and free schools, which are broadly within the same framework, although technically they're independent. Free schools in legal terms more or less are academies. And so they cannot refuse to admit a child by reason of the fact that that child has learning difficulties. There are complications around what happens for a child with an EHC plan, but if you're at the stage when an EHC plan doesn't happen, then basically if a maintained school or an academy has a vacancy, they should admit the child, and they should not be saying, that's too difficult for us, we can't have it. I'm afraid occasionally we do come across that, but it really shouldn't be happening. Once the children are in the school, they have a duty not to discriminate, to make reasonable adjustments, to try to put children on an even footing, and that will include all the obvious adjustments like for your children, issues around sight and so on, and also around behaviour, that you don't necessarily punish someone for behaviour which is the result of the disability where it's happened because the school hasn't made the right adjustments to avoid problems happening. There's a lot of emphasis on identifying and supporting children as quickly as possible. Rightly, I mean, the code of practice goes from 0 to 25 years. And so there's emphasis obviously on health visitors keeping an eye on problems when they do their statutory assessment. Early years providers likewise to try to identify and support children. You should be establishing a baseline when a child comes into a school or a college and continue keeping an eye on it to make sure that they're making the progress that is required. So moving on to the concept of progress, it's a very important one generally when you're making decisions in this system. Concept of less than expected progress, it's defined in the Code of Practice. It's progress that's significantly slower than that of the child's peers, starting from the same baseline, fails to match or better that child's previous rate of progress, i.e. it's sort of fallen off, as it were, fails to close the gap between them and their peers or widens that gap. One of the issues we have with getting support for children is that local authorities tend to look at the tiniest bit of progress and say, they're making progress, what are you complaining about? They don't need an EHC plan. That's not, as this definition illustrates, that's not good enough. At the very least, the gap should not be widening. Ideally, it ought to be narrowing, and it ought to be at least similar to the progress that they've consistently made up to date. So it is not good enough for a local authority to say, we're not going to do anything because this child's made 3 months progress in the last year, or whatever it might be. It's all set out in rather more detail in the Chapter 6 of the Code of Practice and also 9. When we're talking about progress, it's not just academic progress. It will be things like behaviour, social skills, communication, sensory issues, things like that. And one of the most important factors that has to be taken into account is the situation where, although the child is making progress, it's only because they are getting much more support than would normally be available within the school's SEN system and within the resources normally available to schools. You will sometimes get a case where a child is making good progress because the school is absolutely busting a gut and going well beyond the course of duty, which is great. But your problem is that they don't have a duty to do that, and if their funding's cut next year, that progress will disappear. And so it's not guaranteed. And you may have a situation where they're making progress because the parents are putting an awful lot of support in, and they may be getting specialist tuition or therapies and so on. If that's the situation, again, a local authority shouldn't be saying, we don't need to do anything. They should take that into account. There are issues around funding in making decisions, and a lot of local authorities will tell you that if the child can be supported within the resources normally available, which is for children with SEN is roughly £10,000 a year, then you never get any more support. You never get assessed for an EHC plan. That's not really correct, because one of the obvious points is that if you don't assess a child, you don't know what their difficulties are, and we regularly have situations where a local authority or a school is completely in denial about what the child's difficulties are and refuses to assess. You finally do assess and discover that they're much worse than anybody thought, and they do need support. Another point is this factor about guaranteeing it. It's all very well saying the support is there, but if the school isn't doing it, then you may need to assess and you may need an EHC plan, because that's the route into being able to enforce provision. However, just moving back to the child on SEN support, there's a basic duty on schools to keep an eye on it. If the child isn't making adequate progress, the first step is usually to put them onto SEN support, and it's set out in some detail in Chapter 6. There's this initial expectation that it's all going to be done by teachers. They must have high-quality teaching differentiated for individual pupils, and that's okay-ish, but teacher training these days, it's about half a day within the entire course, and they've got 30 kids, and it may be difficult. Parents have to be involved earlier, and then, as I say, move on to SEN support. SEN support is meant to be a graduated progress, a cycle of assess, plan, do, review, i.e. you assess what the problem is, what's needed, you plan how to meet those needs, you do it, and then you review it, see how it's working, maybe go back to the beginning of the cycle. And the idea is you keep reviewing that, and you hope that the child will make progress and everything will be fine, and maybe come back off SEN support. Everyone ought to be kept informed. SENCO obviously ought to be involved. lot of emphasis on keeping parents involved. They've got to be told when a child's put on SEN support. They're supposed to meet the parents 3 times a year, and that really ought to be more than a simple PTA meeting, sorry, parent-teacher meeting, because the idea of these meetings is to set some outcomes, review what's going on, and after that the school ought to make a record of the outcomes and what's going to be done to support that and share that with the parents. It's a bit like the IEP, Individual Education Plan, which was the standard in the past. Still being used sometimes, but it seems to be being phased out, and it's more or less the same, but it's different terminology. Schools really have to keep good records of children. They have to demonstrate that they're using the money properly, both the SEN funding that's delegated to them and pupil premium funding where that applies, and that if they're putting interventions in place like emotional literacy groups, speech and language groups, one-to-one sessions, that it's working, it's providing value for money. And that all schools ought to have an SEN policy. So I'll just rush through quickly, sorry. Everyone's got to have SENCOs, everyone's got to have governors who are responsible, and they've got to keep good records because Ofsted will look at it. Just a quick look at the criteria for assessment. The easy definition is a very low hurdle. Does the child have SEN? Might they need support over and above what's normally available in a mainstream school? So it's quite a low barrier, and that's why, really, a very high percentage of appeals against refusal to assess win. I won't go through all these criteria. They're set out in the Code of Practice. These are all the information everyone has to gather together to decide whether to do a formal assessment of special educational needs. It's worth noting that it's not just schools who can ask for an EHC needs assessment. Parents can. We've got information on our website how to do that. What happens if you ask for an assessment is they've got 6 weeks to decide whether to do it. If they say no, you could appeal. If they say yes, they move on and do the assessment, and they've got roughly 10 weeks to do that. They gather all the evidence together. I'll be talking a bit more about what they're supposed to be doing this afternoon, and decide whether the child is not progressing sufficiently well, taking into account all the support that's been put in place already, and therefore, if they're not making adequate progress, should we issue a plan? And the whole process is meant to take 20 weeks, start to finish, from the date that they receive the original request for an EHC assessment. A lot of local authorities going beyond that, and you should make a fuss if they are going beyond those timetables. And you can, they're statutory timetables, they can be enforced in law. Okay, last bit there, just why you should have an EHC plan. Obviously, all these benefits that results from an proper assessment. It summarises all your child's difficulties. It brings money, obviously, money over and above that $10,000 a year. And the fact that it's enforceable. You can take it to court if your child is not getting it. And good thing is that it's being done in your child's name, so you get legal aid for it. So, as I say, we'll put more flesh on the bones of that this afternoon. But thanks.
Thank you very much.